The world trembled with the low, rolling sound of thunder. Or maybe it was the pounding of horses' hooves against the frozen ground. Emma couldn't tell. All she knew was that her father's shouts had ripped her from sleep, his voice sharp and frantic as he bellowed for her and her little brother Tommy to run. She stumbled from the bed, her legs sluggish with sleep, her heart a drumbeat of terror. Tommy clung to her, his small fingers biting into her wrist as she dragged him toward the back door. Behind them, the cabin shuddered with the force of the assault. Gunshots cracked through the darkness, savage and immediate. Her father's voice cut off with a wet, strangled noise, and her mother's screams rose high and sharp before falling into silence. Emma didn't look back. She couldn't. If she looked, she might see their bodies torn and bleeding in the snow. If she looked, she might freeze and become just another lifeless figure against the pale, indifferent landscape. "Keep running, Tommy," she urged, her voice thin and shaking. They stumbled through the thickets, sharp branches clawing at her face and arms. The cold air burned her lungs, but she didn't stop until the sounds of slaughter faded into the distance, replaced by the soft, lonely wail of the wind. Tommy's sobs were the only sound between them as they crouched beneath the low cover of a fallen pine. Emma wrapped her arms around him, his thin shoulders trembling with every shuddering breath. "Are they dead?" he whispered, his voice hoarse and broken. She didn't answer. She couldn't. Instead, she held him tighter, praying the darkness would swallow them whole and keep them hidden from whatever horrors still lurked beyond the trees. The dawn crept up slowly, a weak, anemic light that did nothing to warm the chill lodged deep in Emma's bones. She coaxed Tommy to his feet, urging him forward as they moved further from the ruins of their life. Her stomach clenched with hunger, but fear kept her legs moving long past the point of exhaustion. Days blurred into a haze of cold and hunger. Emma did what she could to keep Tommy alive, scavenging roots and berries, her fingers numb and bleeding from the harshness of the forest. His face grew pale, cheeks hollowing as his small body wasted away. The snow melted, but spring brought no relief. It was survival, but only just. They came upon the trading post by accident, their steps slow and stumbling. Emma's eyes fixed on the sagging roofs and smoke rising from crude chimneys, the scent of roasting meat so rich and tantalizing that it made her head swim. A man stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over them with a curiosity that quickly curdled into something else. He was thick around the middle, his hair streaked with gray and eyes sharp with appraisal. "Well now, ain't you a sorry sight?" he said, voice smooth and heavy with condescension. "What's your name, girl?" "Emma," she replied, her voice raw. "My brother's sick. We need help." The man's eyes flicked to Tommy, the boy swaying where he stood, his thin arms wrapped tight around his middle. For a moment, the man's expression softened, a flash of something like pity. But then it was gone, replaced by calculation. "I reckon we can find something for you here," he said, his smile spreading like oil over water. "You just come on with me, girl. We'll get your brother fixed up right." Emma hesitated, but desperation outweighed caution. She followed him into the warmth of the post, Tommy's weight a dead pull against her arm. They were given food, bread and salted meat that Emma tore into with all the restraint of a starving animal. She didn't notice the way the man watched her, his gaze gleaming with something far more sinister than kindness. Nor did she notice the other men in the room, their murmured conversations cutting off when she looked their way. The man introduced himself as Mr. Thorne, his voice all honey and smiles as he spoke of opportunity and shelter. It was only later, when Emma and Tommy were led away from the fire's warmth and shoved into a small, windowless room, that she began to understand the truth of their situation. Tommy grew weaker, his breaths thin and strained. She begged Mr. Thorne for medicine, for anything that might help him, but all he offered were empty promises. The day Tommy died, something in Emma fractured. She cradled his tiny body for hours, her tears long spent, her voice a broken rasp as she whispered apologies into his cold skin. When they came for her that night, dragging her from the room where Tommy's body still lay, she fought with the wild desperation of a cornered animal. But there were too many hands, too much strength bearing down upon her until she was nothing but a trembling, bruised mess on the dirt floor. They took her to Madam Blackwell. A woman of severe beauty, her face sculpted from marble and her eyes sharp as knives. She looked Emma over with the same appraising gaze Mr. Thorne had, her lips curving in a smile that promised nothing good. "You'll do," Madam Blackwell said, her voice cool and clipped. "You're young. Pretty enough once you're cleaned up. A little wild, but we'll break that out of you soon enough." Emma didn't speak. She didn't cry. There was nothing left to say, nothing left to mourn. She had been hollowed out, scraped clean of hope and left to rot in the dank, smoke-choked halls of Madam Blackwell's brothel. The other girls avoided her, their faces drawn and eyes dull. There was kindness there, sometimes, a stolen crust of bread, a whispered word of encouragement, but more often than not, it was every girl for herself. Madam Blackwell's punishments were swift and brutal, her temper a blade that cut through any hint of defiance. Emma learned to keep her head down, to endure the cruelty with a stony silence that only seemed to infuriate her captors further. But beneath the quiet compliance, a fire smoldered. Emma could feel it, a fierce, burning heat that refused to die. She would not break. She would not be consumed by the darkness of that place. Every night, she stared out through the narrow, barred window, her gaze fixed on the distant line of the forest. She would find her way back to the world beyond those walls. No matter what it took. Emma learned to move with purpose, her gaze lowered but her senses sharpened like a blade. Days bled into weeks, her life reduced to the narrow corridors and shadowed rooms of Madam Blackwell's brothel. She mastered the art of being invisible, of slipping through spaces unnoticed and unheard. It was her armor, the only protection she could forge in a place where mercy was scarce and kindness even rarer. Her first real connection came from Lottie, a woman with eyes the color of worn copper and a smile that trembled as if afraid of its own existence. Lottie was older, her face marked by years of hardship and beauty fading beneath the weight of cruelty. Yet she carried herself with a certain resilience, a flicker of brightness that had not yet been extinguished. "You'll die if you don't learn how to survive here," Lottie warned one night, her voice low and urgent. They were huddled in a corner of the kitchen, stealing warmth from the lingering heat of the dying fire. Madam Blackwell likes to break girls. She likes to see them shattered and begging. Don't give her that pleasure. Emma nodded, her jaw clenched tight. She had been in that place long enough to understand Lottie's words were not just caution but truth. The other girls flinched at the sound of the madam's voice, their eyes hollowed by terror and resignation. Emma swore she would never let herself become like them. Lottie taught her how to avoid the worst of it. Which corners to hide in when tempers flared, which customers were best avoided, and how to endure pain without making a sound. The lessons were brutal, but they were necessary. Emma absorbed them with the grim determination of someone with nothing left to lose. There were nights when the brothel hummed with drunken laughter and rough voices, the air thick with the stench of sweat and cheap liquor. Emma worked in the back, scrubbing floors until her fingers bled, her body ached, and her mind grew numb. But she listened, her ears keen to every word spoken. Information, Lottie said, was a currency more valuable than gold. Carter was one of Madam Blackwell's guards, a man whose loyalty seemed to flicker between greed and guilt. He was not cruel, not in the way some of the others were, but neither was he kind. Emma saw him as something less than an enemy but far from a friend. He carried a hardness about him, his eyes dulled by drink and resignation. Still, he would sometimes slip her scraps of food or speak a word of warning when tempers ran too high. Emma couldn't afford to trust him, but neither could she ignore the small mercies he granted. She took what she could get, her gratitude muted but genuine. One night, Lottie led Emma to the brothel's attic, a cramped space crammed with forgotten furniture and the stench of rot. It was there that Lottie revealed her secret, a stash of coins hidden beneath a loose floorboard, saved from tips and stolen whenever she dared. "Why are you showing me this?" Emma asked, her voice wary. "Because you're like me," Lottie replied, her gaze fierce. "You haven't broken. Not yet. And if you play your cards right, you might just make it out of here." Emma felt something stir within her, a fragile thread of hope woven through the bitterness and despair. They began to plan, their voices low and urgent as they whispered of escape. Lottie spoke of towns far from the brothel's reach, places where they could find work, build new lives. Emma clung to the idea like a lifeline, her dreams painted in vivid strokes of freedom and revenge. The plan was simple. They would wait for the spring festival, when the town would be too drunk and distracted to notice two women slipping into the night. Lottie's coins would be enough to buy them passage on a wagon headed west, away from Madam Blackwell's claws. But the nights grew longer, and with them came the weight of suspicion. Madam Blackwell had a talent for sensing rebellion, her cruelty sharpened by years of crushing defiance. Emma could feel her eyes upon her, cold and searching, as if the madam could taste the desperation simmering beneath her skin. It was Carter who betrayed them. Emma learned this only after it was too late, his guilt-ridden gaze meeting hers with a flicker of something that might have been regret. She had been careless, her determination dulling her caution. A whispered conversation overheard, a stolen glance caught by watchful eyes. They came for Lottie first. Dragged from her room in the dead of night, her screams muffled by the thick, merciless hands of the guards. Emma pressed her hands over her ears, Her body curled tight against the wall as if she could somehow shut out the sound of Lottie's agony. It went on and on, each cry chipping away at what little strength Emma had left. The next morning Lottie was gone. Emma searched for her, frantic and wild, but there was no sign of the woman who had taught her how to survive. Madam Blackwell's smile was sharper than usual, her satisfaction gleaming like a blade in the dim light. "You should thank me," Madam Blackwell purred when Emma dared to question her. "That one was nothing but trouble. A bad influence. You're better off without her." Emma's hatred burned so fiercely it left her breathless. Lottie's absence left a hollow ache inside her, a wound that throbbed with every reminder of her own failure. She had trusted Carter. She had dared to hope. And it had cost her the only friend she had. Days stretched into an unending blur of labor and pain. Emma kept her head down, her lips pressed tight against words that would only bring more suffering. But the fire inside her had not gone out. It burned hotter, fueled by the memory of Lottie's kindness and the knowledge that betrayal lurked around every corner. Carter tried to speak to her once, his voice thick with shame and clumsy attempts at apology. Emma looked through him as if he were nothing more than smoke. He had shown her mercy once, but his weakness had destroyed everything she had clung to. The darkness of the brothel seemed deeper than ever, its walls closing in like the jaws of a beast. Emma could feel herself slipping, her will eroding beneath the weight of grief and fury. But she refused to break. She refused to give Madam Blackwell the satisfaction of her surrender. Instead she plotted. This time she would be careful. This time she would trust no one but herself. Emma lay awake at night, her eyes fixed on the narrow strip of sky visible through the barred window. Lottie's name was a whisper on her lips, a vow forged in the silence. She would get out. She would find freedom or she would die trying. Emma's gaze was drawn to him the moment he strode into the brothel, a man whose presence commanded attention without effort or artifice. He moved with a predator's grace, his dark eyes sharp and vigilant as they swept over the room. The other girls whispered of him in tones steeped in awe and caution. A Cheyenne warrior, bold enough to walk into Madam Blackwell's den without fear or invitation. Emma watched from the shadows, her fingers clenched around the rag she used to clean tables. Men came and went, their faces blurred by alcohol and cruelty, but this man was different. His gaze cut through the dim haze of smoke and desperation, his expression unreadable yet unyielding. Madam Blackwell approached him with the sickly sweetness she reserved for dangerous patrons. Her smile was all sharp edges, her voice a purr meant to lure and manipulate. "What brings you to my establishment, stranger? Looking for pleasure or profit?" "Neither." His voice was calm, steady. "I seek answers." "What kind of answers?" Madam Blackwell's smile faltered, her eyes narrowing. "Information about the traders who pass through this town. Names, faces, patterns. And those who traffic in what they shouldn't." His gaze held no warmth, only the weight of unyielding purpose. Madam Blackwell's smile returned, but it was forced now, strained beneath the knowledge that this man was not one to be toyed with. "I deal in many things but not information. Unless, of course, you have something worth trading." The warrior's gaze shifted, passing over the girls clustered near the bar, their laughter brittle and false. When his eyes landed on Emma, she felt their weight like a physical touch. It was the first time in years anyone had looked at her and truly seen her. "I'll find what I need," he said, his gaze lingering on Emma before moving away. "One way or another." He left without another word, his silhouette swallowed by the night. But the memory of his eyes remained, burned into Emma's mind like the hot edge of a brand. Days passed, the brothel's routine grinding on with its usual blend of cruelty and monotony. Yet Emma could not forget the Cheyenne warrior. His presence had disturbed something deep within her, a restlessness that refused to be stilled. It was nearly a week later when she saw him again, his figure cutting through the fog of early morning like a knife. She was hauling water from the well, her muscles aching from the endless toil. He approached her without hesitation, his expression unreadable. "You're Emma." It was not a question but a statement. She nodded, her wariness sharpening into something else. "You've been asking about me." "Yes." He did not bother with pretenses. "I've heard whispers of a girl kept here against her will. A girl who knows things. I need your help." She laughed, the sound brittle and laced with bitterness. "And why would I help you? No one here gives anything for free." His gaze did not waver. "Because you want to be free. And I can help you." Emma's heart stuttered, her skepticism tempered by a flicker of hope. "Why would you help me? What do you want in return?" "I need information about Madam Blackwell's dealings. About the traders who come through here." He stepped closer, his voice low and urgent. There are people she has sold, people from my tribe. Children, women. I intend to find them. The fury in his voice was a live, crackling thing. Emma understood that kind of rage, the way it could hollow you out and fill you with something stronger than pain. If I help you, will you get me out of here? Emma asked, her voice trembling with the weight of her own desperation. Yes. His answer was immediate, without hesitation. But you have to be careful. If she suspects anything, it will be the end for both of us. Emma considered his words, her mind racing. She had tried to escape before, her plans crushed beneath Madam Blackwell's cruelty. But this man, Kane, he finally told her his name, was not like the others. He carried himself with the air of someone who had nothing left to lose. They began their alliance in secret, their conversations conducted in stolen moments and whispers. Emma fed him information when she could, names of traitors, snippets of conversation overheard from drunken patrons. Kane's visits became more frequent, his presence a beacon of hope Emma clung to with a desperation she barely understood. But trust was a fragile thing, easily shattered and impossible to rebuild. Emma's wariness never fully faded, her eyes always searching for the hint of betrayal she had come to expect from everyone around her. Kane proved patient. He listened to her stories, her struggles, her grief over Tommy's death. In return, he shared fragments of his own life, how he had lost his family to raiders, how he hunted those who profited from the suffering of others. You fight for revenge, Emma said one night, her voice strained from the effort of keeping it low. Just like me. I fight for justice, Kane corrected, his gaze steady. But revenge, it's there too. It drives me forward. Emma understood that fire. It burned within her, hot and relentless. She saw it reflected in Kane's eyes and realized she was not as alone as she had believed. Their plan took shape over weeks, honed by Kane's experience and Emma's familiarity with the brothel's inner workings. She knew where the guards were stationed, which nights Madam Blackwell grew too drunk to notice much of anything. The night of their escape came without ceremony. Kane slipped into the brothel under the guise of a paying customer, his features shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. Emma met him at the back in trance, her nerves taut and trembling. The darkness was their ally, the cover of night masking their departure as they slipped through the narrow alleyways and into the dense, untamed wilderness beyond the town. They moved quickly, Kane's pace relentless as they left the brothel's clutches behind. Emma's lungs burned, her legs quaking from exertion, but she pushed on, the thought of freedom more potent than pain. When they finally paused, Emma collapsed against the rough bark of a tree, her chest heaving. Kane crouched beside her, his eyes searching hers. You did well, he said, his voice rough but not unkind. Emma managed a shaky smile, the weight of her exhaustion mingling with the exhilaration of escape. For the first time in years she felt something other than despair. Oh. But even as she savored the sweetness of it, she knew their troubles were far from over. Kane's enemies were powerful, and Madam Blackwell would not let her go so easily. Yet as Emma met Kane's gaze, she found herself believing that perhaps, just perhaps, they had a chance. And that was more than she had ever dared to hope for. The world beyond the brothel's walls was both savage and beautiful. The air smelled of pine and earth, so sharp and clean it made Emma's chest ache. The landscape stretched out before them, wild and untamed, its rawness both a promise and a threat. Kane moved with certainty, his stride sure-footed as he led her deeper into the wilderness. The forest closed around them, thick with shadows and the rustle of unseen creatures. Emma stumbled often, her feet clumsy over the uneven ground. The clothes she wore were thin and ill-suited for the chill that crept in with the dusk. But she kept moving, her gaze fixed on Kane's broad shoulders, his steady pace her only anchor. They walked until her legs trembled with exhaustion, her breath little more than shallow gasps. When Kane finally stopped, it was near a small stream that cut through the earth like a silver vein. He crouched by the water's edge, his gaze sweeping the surroundings before nodding once, satisfied. We rest here tonight, he said, his voice low and even. Emma collapsed to her knees, her limbs shaking with fatigue. Kane handed her a strip of dried meat from his pack, his expression unreadable. She accepted it without question, chewing slowly as she watched him kindle a fire from twigs and dried leaves. The silence between them stretched, broken only by the crackle of flames and the distant call of a night bird. Emma's body ached, her mind frayed from the rush of their escape. But beneath the exhaustion, something fierce and stubborn burned. Why did you help me? Emma asked finally, her voice raw. You could have just taken what you needed and left. Kane's gaze flickered to her, his eyes shadowed but steady. Because you deserved better than that place. And because I needed someone who knew how to listen. You hear things others don't. See things others overlook. Emma laughed, the sound bitter and sharp. You make it sound like I have some kind of gift. All I did was survive. That's more than most can say, Kane replied. Surviving isn't easy. Especially when everything around you is trying to tear you apart. His words struck something deep within her, a truth she had not dared acknowledge. Emma had survived. Against all odds, against cruelty and betrayal, she had endured. It was a strength she had never recognized in herself, one forged through suffering and loss. As the night deepened, they spoke in fits and starts, their conversation halting and uncertain. Kane told her of his search for the stolen members of his tribe, the rage that had driven him to hunt down the traitors responsible. Emma shared her own story, her words stilted and raw as she recounted the night her family had been slaughtered, the years spent under Madam Blackwell's iron grip. Revenge is all I have left, she admitted, her voice a rasp. Everything else was taken from me. Kane's expression softened, his gaze distant. Revenge is a fire that consumes everything. But sometimes, it's the only light left to guide you. They continued their journey at dawn, the forest thick with mist and the scent of damp earth. Kane's pace was relentless, his urgency pressing against Emma like a constant, unseen force. But she kept up, her determination hardening with each step. They avoided the main roads, moving through the wilds with the stealth of hunted animals. Kane's knowledge of the land was uncanny, his instincts sharp and unfaltering. He taught her how to find food, how to move silently through the brush, how to read the signs left by other travelers. Days bled into one another, the rhythm of their journey a brutal yet necessary ritual. Emma's body grew stronger, her senses honed by the constant vigilance their trek required. Kane's presence was a constant, his guidance equal parts stern and patient. Emma learned to watch him, to decipher the subtle shifts in his expression and the unspoken messages threaded through his words. He was a man driven by purpose, his past shadowed by pain and guilt. But there was kindness there too, buried beneath the hardness. It was Kane who noticed the riders first. They were a day's journey from the Cheyenne camp he had spoken of, the place where he hoped to find the survivors of the raids. Emma saw the tension coil through him, his shoulders stiffening as he scanned the horizon. Madam Blackwell's men, he said, his voice clipped. They found us. Panic flared in Emma's chest, a wild, clawing fear that threatened to steal her breath. But she forced it down, her fingers curling into fists. She would not run. Not again. They won't stop until they have me, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her limbs. Or until they're dead. Kane's gaze met hers, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded, a grim smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Then we make our stand. They chose their ground carefully, a rocky outcrop surrounded by dense trees. Kane set traps with a skill born of experience, his hands quick and sure as he prepared for the fight to come. Emma watched him, her own resolve hardening. When the riders came, their approach was swift and ruthless. Emma counted 6 of them, their faces twisted with greed and malice. Carter was among them, his gaze sweeping the terrain with a predator's hunger. Emma's hatred flared, her fingers tight around the knife Kane had given her. The first trap triggered with a sudden, violent snap, the horse's scream echoing through the trees. Kane moved like a shadow, his arrows swift and precise. Emma fought with the desperation of someone who had nothing left to lose. The blade felt foreign in her hand, but her strikes were driven by fury and fear. She took down one of the men, her knife sinking deep into his side before she twisted away from his grasp. Carter came for her last, his eyes wild and filled with something darker than greed. I knew you were trouble, he sneered, his voice ragged. Should have let the madam break you properly. Maybe she did. Emma's voice was calm, cold. But you're the one who's broken now. She lunged forward, the blade cutting a savage arc through the air. Carter's scream was brief, choked off by the blood bubbling from his throat. The battle ended in silence, the bodies strewn across the ground like broken dolls. Kane wiped blood from his blade, his breathing harsh but controlled. Emma stared at her shaking hands, the knife slick with red. It's over, Kane said, his voice rough. Emma looked up at him, her eyes burning. No. It's just beginning. They left the bodies where they lay, the forest swallowing the carnage as if it had never been. Kane led her onward, his expression solemn but his steps sure. Emma followed, her resolve a steel thread that refused to break. She was no longer the girl who had been dragged into Madam Blackwell's hell. She was something new, something forged from fire and blood. And she would not rest until she had torn down every last vestige of the life that had tried to destroy her.